teaching our way out of the cave, how peace and conflict educators challenge war, violence, and human suffering. So there's this picture up there of this pencil drawing of a cave. It looks like a giant mouth about to eat us. So you might be a little confused, like, what the heck is this guy going to be talking about? It's all going to make sense in a little bit. I'm a visual thinker. I think a lot with metaphors and analogies, so I'm going to use a metaphor and an analogy to walk you through some ideas that will help us look at the current state, or rather perceptions, of global conflict. I think how a lot of the global public is informed and educated about violent conflict and approaches to peace and addressing violent conflict, and then what our role is as educators in that space and in that context. So, like I said, that's the first part of my presentation, is answering this question: what is the current state and perception of global conflict? And then the second part of my presentation is, how can the content that we teach as peace and conflict educators, or would-be peace and conflict educators, be reflected in the way that we teach? So that'll be the second part. So we'll look at some pedagogical ideas, principles, aspirations, if you will, in the second part of the presentation. So what's the current state and perception of global conflict? I would say that, in my opinion, there's still a relatively myopic perception of what constitutes conflict, particularly violent conflict, and what constitutes our strategies and approaches to addressing conflict. And what I want to do is, I want you all to imagine that you are spelunking, I think that's the verb, caving, and you find yourself in this cavern, in this cave. And as you walk through this cave, you will notice that there are all these stalactites. These are the big formations that fall down from the cave ceiling. And there are all these stalagmites that rise up from the cave floor. Now, if you were a novice or first experience with a cave, it's very easy to reduce the whole concept of a cave to simply these rock formations, these stalactites and stalagmites. But as cave enthusiasts know, there's a lot more to this cave and this setting than what meets the eye. And I think peace and conflict educators and peace and conflict departments, they try and push against that same reduction as it relates to peace and conflict. So I want you to imagine now, I want you to imagine that all these stalactites coming down from the ceiling, all these stalagmites that are coming up from the bottom, I want you to see all of these rock formations as problems of direct physical violence that we are asked to solve or address. So when I talk about problems of direct violence, what is direct violence? And this is borrowing from Johann Galtung's language and Martin Luther King's language of direct violence. So we're talking about armed conflict, like all-out war. We're talking about rape, sexual assault, genocide, gang feuds in neighborhoods, terrorism, bullying in schools. These are all well-known, well-reported examples of direct physical violence. So if we are someone who's asked to address violent conflict, and we're asked to strategize and develop approaches to peace to address these, if we're in the cave, you might think, okay, well, what we have to do in order to ensure that people can walk through this cave in relative peace and security is, well, we just need to knock out these stalactites and stalagmites. We need to chisel them out. We need to hammer them with a big sledgehammer. We need to kick them over. And we can walk through this cave in relative peace and security. But we actually know that, as I said, there's a lot more to this cave than meets the eye. So this idea of kicking over these stalactites, knocking over this direct violence, addressing this direct violence, there's a lot of approaches to do that. And a lot of them you've heard about in the news. And that kind of constitutes a negative peace approach to addressing conflict. Negative peace meaning the absence of direct physical violence, the negation of direct physical violence. So if we get rid of these things somehow, and we can stop these bad things, we will have peace. So what are some examples of a negative peace approach to addressing violent conflict? Well, we can send UN peacekeepers in. UN peacekeepers can go in and they can hold warring factions at bay and say, stop fighting, stop killing each other. and they can enforce a ceasefire agreement. Your political elites or diplomats or whatever have made some agreement that you're going to stop shooting at each other, and we're going to enforce that. No more shooting, we have peace. You could build more prisons. We've got a lot of gangs out there, a lot of gun violence in our neighborhood. We need to build more prisons. We need to build more prison cells so we can lock up dangerous, violent people. If you take dangerous, violent people off of the street, out of your neighborhood, and put them in prisons, we have peace. You can get more cops. You can get more security forces. Let's say you've got a lot of demonstrations in the street. You can put them into the street to enforce some type of stability and security. So you can put more security forces in the street. We have peace. You can dismantle violent weapons. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons just won the Nobel Peace Prize, doing amazing work in Syria. I believe that this is the first time that organization has actually done this work in an actual conflict area. But their job is to dismantle and destroy weapons that are designed to kill people. So if you destroy and dismantle these weapons, you have peace to a certain extent. You can build walls and fences that deny access for people to your home, to your neighborhood, to your entire country, particularly people that you deem dangerous or unwanted. So we can build fences and we can build walls, and that will increase peace and stability. You can suspend students. You've been bullying, well, just get out of the school. We don't want you here. Or we're going to isolate you in a room in a school so you can't interact with the other students. And that will stop the bullying. That's a negative peace approach. It brings about peace, some would argue. Or let's keep going down that road. You can assassinate people. Arguments are made. Assassinations are justified, saying this is a really bad person who's plotting horrible things against these people, this country, this government, and we need to get rid of them. Is assassinating and killing Osama bin Laden, does that make the world a more peaceful place? Many people would argue absolutely. So you can see where we're going with this is that I think we all are familiar with these examples. Walls and fences, border fences, walls separating Israel and Palestine, UN peacekeepers, the group that just won the Nobel Peace Prize, a lot of work around bullying and how to address bullies. We are familiar with negative peace approaches to addressing violent conflict. And I'm not saying that these are worthless efforts. Many of them are valiant efforts. In the case of dismantling weapons, some of them have very good outcomes. But that's a specific strategy and approach to addressing conflict, particularly as we go back to our analogy, if your view of violent conflict is in that narrow path of stalactites and stalagmites in a cave. So what do we as peace and conflict educators, what are we being asked to do when we teach courses on this subject matter and we introduce our students to this field? We're asking ourselves and we're asking our students to broaden their perspective on what we mean or what we understand to be violence. And if we can broaden that perspective, we can also broaden our ideas on what our strategies and ideas are for addressing that. So right here, this highlighted yellow area, this is where we just were in our spelunking adventure. We were down here and we were looking at these stalactites and these stalagmites, and we spent a little bit of time exploring these concepts of direct physical violence and negative peace approaches to address direct physical violence. But as you see, that little area in which we were standing is part of a much larger system that has a number of other forces that impact what this little area, what this little cavern looks like. We know that there's a lot that goes on above and below that little spot that create these stalactites and stalagmites. They don't exist in isolation. The same concept goes to violent conflict. We know that there are a lot of things that create the conditions under which direct physical violence is more likely to be experienced by individuals. And this is where the idea of structural violence comes in. This is another word that we borrow, that we use from Johann Galtung and Dr. Martin Luther King. Structural violence. Structural violence are the structures and systems that create the conditions that make it more likely that humans and individuals will be either the victims or perpetrators of direct physical violence. Why are people shooting at each other? we can ask the question, if a country is engaged in armed conflict, is it because they are competing over a limited amount of scarce resources? Are they fighting because there's an inequitable distribution of wealth? And people say, why does this segment of the population have access to all this wealth and resources, but we don't? We can talk about overconsumption. Why are there scarce resources? Is there one part of the world that is consuming entirely too much of a set amount of resources, where other parts of the world are denied access to that resource? So this whole idea of overconsumption. When we're talking about rape and sexual assault, particularly among women, well, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, is the conflict at which rape and sexual assault is used as a weapon at the macro level, or where rape and sexual assault is common in a home or in a family, are those acts of violence happening under a set of conditions where women are treated and seen as objects and commodities and as subject to men? So we're dealing with issues of gender inequality and patriarchy that establish a set of conditions that make it more likely that rape and sexual assault, particularly against women, will occur. When we're looking at genocide, why is a government or a dictatorship trying to systematically exterminate an entire ethnic population? Is it because there's a biased education system that has been scapegoating an entire segment of the population, blaming that segment of the population for their country's problems? Is it because there's been institutionalized or legalized racism, where you're actually legally taught, in a certain sense, to say this group is less than this group? Are we talking about segregated communities? We don't want these people living together because they're different. And one group is good and one group is bad, or one group is better than the other. So if we want to start scapegoating people, we can draw on our segregated community to say, well, that's the bad group or that's the less than group. Social marginalization. When we're talking about feuding gangs and gun violence, why is it that there are individuals who feel the need or have the desire to join a gang that commits violent acts? Well, is it because that's one of the only opportunities they see for financial opportunity and for some type of community belonging? Then we're looking at this idea of underserved and under-resourced schools, because that school is not providing that type of experience for those people. We're looking at poverty. We're looking at the lack of access to economic opportunity, where again the idea of if I join a gang, that was what I determined to be my best access to some type of financial upliftment or opportunity. So these are all examples of structural violence. Structures and systems that create the conditions that make the experience of direct violence more likely. So if we're looking at structural violence, and what are our strategies and approaches to peace to address that? And this is where the concept of positive peace comes in. So positive peace, in contrast to negative peace, is the presence of something positive as opposed to the absence of something negative. So what do we mean by that? It's the presence of something positive as opposed to the absence of something negative. Micro-lending programs, providing small loans to particularly low-income women in poverty-stricken areas so they can have enough capital to start their own business, to have some type of economic power and influence in that community. Some of you may be familiar with microfinancing and microlending programs. They're not always necessarily talked about as being a peace-building program, but if we understand violence as direct violence versus structural violence in this context, we can see that microlending is an approach to peace. Dialogue circles, cross-cultural learning, opportunities for groups of individuals who have been in conflict with one another to come together in dialogue around the issues that are affecting that conflict, to understand their respective cultures and the perspectives that they are bringing to that conflict. I think of, for example, the organization and the camp Seeds of Peace. Some of you may be familiar with them. Seeds of Peace is a camp in Maine, and I think they have a camp in another part of the world, but they bring together young men and women, teenagers from conflict areas around the world. Israel, Palestine, India, and Pakistan. And they come and they have a camp experience where they camp together, they play sports together, and they engage in cross-cultural learning and dialogue circles so that they can be seeds of peace and peace builders when they go back to their home countries. I'm thinking of transnational alliances that address particular issues. So if we're looking at patriarchy and gender inequality, there are a number of organizations around the world that are in an alliance called Men Engage. And you can write these down and check them out on the internet later, Seeds of Peace and then Men Engage. Men Engage is an alliance of organizations that work with men and young boys to support feminism and to challenge violence and inequitable versions of manhood. So it takes the onus off of, well, this is what women need to do in order to be safer. This is the way they need to change their lives. But instead turn the focus on, well, men are more often than not the perpetrators of sexual violence. So what do men need to do? How do they need to change their behavior and their concept of self in order to reduce sexual assault and rape? Nonviolent resistance, or nonviolent action, or nonviolent movements. I'm thinking specifically in this case, if we're talking about the inequitable distribution of wealth, or we're talking about scarce resources or overconsumption, I'm thinking about one, the Occupy movement, not just here in the United States, but all around the world, where people are saying we need to address the inequitable distribution of wealth. We need to address programs that are governments that are defunding all these public services and social safety nets. I'm thinking about the environmental movement. I'm thinking about organizations like 350.org that are challenging people to think differently about how they consume energy and what impact that has on the climate and what impact rising climate or rising temperatures and global climate change has on general human security, access to arable land, access to water, and so forth. Then I'm also thinking about radio shows and social media campaigns, television shows, video games, musical albums, media productions that, as one of the famous TV icons, Mr. Rogers, says, media productions that provide a, quote, expression of care to the individuals who consume that content. And I know that one of the organizations that you'll be hearing from over the next 4 days is an organization called Search for Common Ground. And they do some of the most phenomenal, amazing work around producing media content for peace building. So they'll provide a great example of that positive peace approach to addressing structural violence. Let me back up here. So we work with our students to broaden their view of what constitutes violence. Because yes, we will hear about all of this direct violence in the news, we'll read about it in the newspaper, absolutely. But as peace builders, as peacemakers, as peace and conflict educators, I view my role, and potentially your role, as let's spend some time focusing on structural violence as well, so that these stalactites and stalagmites, these formations of direct violence, we don't even want those problems to emerge. We have the tools to address them when they do, but we want to go to the source. We want to know what is creating the conditions under which direct violence is more likely. So the last part, and I'm going to talk about not bias education specifically, but education in general, because a lot of the work that you all do and will be doing as individuals who teach about peace and conflict that is also very much a positive peace approach to structural violence. Okay, we want to address some of the assumptions that students have coming into our classrooms about violence and conflict and peace building. And peace and conflict studies does that. So the programs and the classes that you're creating will be a part of that positive peace approach. So I'm going to go into that, which is how can the content we teach about peace and conflict be reflected in the way that we teach. And I'm going to use two very overused, dare I say, cliche quotes, but they're just very relevant to this part of the presentation. Both of them come from Gandhi, who just, I think, celebrated his birthday last week. The first is, we must be the change we wish to see in the world. I'm sure everyone has heard that quote before. That is essentially, I think, what we need to tell ourselves if we're anyone interested in creating a better world. Are we modeling the types of behaviors? Are we setting up the type of systems and environments in the hour, 2 hours, 3 hours that we have our students in this particular space? Are we setting up a system that models what we want the world to be? Are we treating each other, are we treating our students and our learners in a way that we would like yourselves to be treated and them to treat other people? Are we modeling that so that they can walk away from the experience not just with content and ideas, but also a set of skills and a set of attitudes? And then the next quote is also, if the means are just, the ends will take care of themselves. If the means are just, the ends will take care of themselves. I think this is one of the most profound Gandhi quotes. Everyone's like, well, the ends justify the means. We all know that. He said, no, squash that. If the means are just, the ends will take care of themselves. Meaning, if we can go into our classrooms and with intentionality, we're creating those peaceable communities, good things will come out of it. Yes, we have a curriculum to get to. Yes, we have lesson plans to get to. Yes, there's assessments that students have to go through. But I have faith that if students can walk out of my classrooms having said, wow, that was a peaceable experience, that was a peaceable learning experience, then I know that the ends will take care of themselves. So this 7 blossoms of peace education, as I said, are just basically a set of principles, a set of aspirations that I keep in mind when I design my courses. And I think these are also, I did say that I think they're particularly relevant to peace and conflict classes, but in reality, I've used these set of aspirations and principles with teachers who teach any subject matter. Many of the classes I teach at American University are with DC public school teachers who teach preschool all the way to adult literacy. So, we're talking 4-year-olds all the way to 30-year-olds, and working in completely different contexts, teaching completely different courses: math, science, physical education, music, whatever. And they have found value in these aspirations and in these blossoms. So what are they? The first is community building. So that means that we're finding things with our group of learners that bind us and unite us together, while at the same time recognizing our differences and then celebrating those differences. There's a lot of emphasis on like, oh, we're united, we're all together, and then there's a tendency to deny that we actually are different from one another, and that's not something to be afraid of or to deny, but to actually draw out and then to celebrate and use to our advantage as a learning community. So I always ask people, just by a show of hands, how many of you have gone through an entire semester or an entire year in a class, spending every day or a couple times a week with the same group of learners, and you've gotten to the end of that experience and you didn't know the name of everyone else in that room? Okay, when I work with undergrads and I ask them that question, every single hand goes up. I mean, they're just right out of high school, they've had maybe a couple years in college, and they're like, wow, pretty much every class I've taken, whether it's with 10 people or with 100 people, I walk out of that class and I don't know the name of pretty much anybody that was in that space with me for that semester. Now, names are important, and that's why I love the name tags here. Names are really important. To hear your name being said by your professor, your teacher, or by your peers makes conversation a lot easier. If someone says something that you agree with and you want to prop up, or you want to support, or you want to disagree with them, or provide feedback, you hesitate if you can only say, oh yeah, what that person said. If you don't know their name, it makes it very hard for that community to be created. So that's a simple thing, it's just knowing names. One of the recommended resources that I have here at the bottom, and the slides I'll send out, and these are all linkable. I do something called a cocktail party. We don't have cocktails, but it's a cocktail party or thought-provoking questions. And the first class of any class that I teach in any semester with any age group is I have them break up into small groups, and the students in about groups of 5, and they ask each other, quote, thought-provoking questions. And the first one usually is, if you could have dinner with anyone, past or present, dead or alive, who would that person be and why? So they all introduce themselves to each other. My name is Daryn, I'm a sophomore, I'm from Arlington, Virginia, and if I could have dinner with anyone, it would be my grandfather, because he died before I was born. And my mom has always said great things about him, and it would be nice to have that grandfather figure. When I share that with somebody, and they hear that, that person knows a lot more about me other than that's the dude that sits next to me in class. And imagine hearing that from 4 or 5 other people in that group. And then I have one student from each of those small groups stand up and share it with the rest of the class. So not everyone goes around and shares. It's just one person who the group thinks, wow, that was a really unique answer. You know, it wasn't like, not that Jesus isn't a good answer, but that's a common one. You know, people are like, oh yeah, Jesus. But something that was like, wow, I never thought about having dinner with somebody like that. So that's a good example. Another good example is a process that you all have probably experienced, you'll be experiencing, I think, on Monday, which is the World Cafe process. That is a brilliant and beautiful process for creating community amongst a learning group. So this actually is a picture of a workshop that a colleague and I facilitated in Cambodia earlier this year. None of these individuals speak English. I do not speak Khmer. But we are having an absolute blast right here. This is an icebreaker. We're doing a rock, paper, scissors icebreaker. These are all adults. These are all people experiencing direct violence on a daily basis. And we're working through and grappling with a lot of these ideas, particularly around nonviolent action. And long day, it's hot, and we did this icebreaker. And what I think this picture captures is something that the psychologist Martin Seligman writes about, which is that laughter tunes the group. Laughter tunes the group. I know some people are kind of like icebreakers, oh, so stupid, you know. But if facilitated well and with intentionality at the right time, and you engage a group of learners in laughter and in play and collaborative problem solving, that creates a real sense of community and solidarity, particularly with laughter. And I think every face in this picture, I think just speaks volumes. This is right after lunch. People were tired. We were exhausted. And all of a sudden, laughter really brought the group back together. So second aspiration is this idea of enabling multiple intelligences. And so that means that we're consciously balancing the learning experiences by engaging our students in ways that play to their strengths as learners, while also challenging them to develop, acknowledge, and value other forms of intelligence. Now, multiple intelligences is an idea that was developed by Harvard psychologist Howard Gardner. And he identified 8 different kinds of intelligences, or intelligences that aid the learning process. And he argued that oftentimes education really only focuses on, our educational experiences only utilize 2 of those intelligences, which is the verbal linguistic, which is what I'm doing right now. If you all are great verbal learners and you can sit and listen to somebody talk for a long time, this is great for you. I'm also tapping into maybe some of the visual learners. We had the cave analogy and all the kinds of things. So if visual aids are something that really help you understand a concept, trying to tap into that. Then he also says that logical and mathematical, having folks follow a line of argumentation, or or writing their own line of argumentation, whether it's a mathematical problem or a political argument or whatever. He says that the verbal, linguistic, and the logical, mathematical are the ones that are really stressed and used a lot in most educational settings. But he says there are many others. So I don't know if you can see this, but you'll get the PowerPoint. But he says the linguistic, so we can read, we can write, we can talk, we can listen. The logical, mathematical, we quantify things, we think critically, we reason, we experiment. We're all familiar with these things in our classes. Then there's the visual, spatial. We see things, we draw things, we visualize things, we color things, we map out things, and create visual representations of ideas that we're exploring. Then there's a bodily kinesthetic. We build something, create something, we act something out. We physically touch something that we've created or brought in. We move our bodies, we dance. These are all ways to explore an idea. Dance, I want to share with you an organization, a great organization called Move This World, formerly called Dance for Peace, but now they're called Move This World. It is an international organization that uses movement and dance to explore ideas of peace and conflict resolution. And other ideas, cross-cultural learning and diversity. They do amazing stuff using your body, with young people and old people, using your body and movement to explore some of these ideas. Musical, we sing, we rap, we drum, we play instruments. How can you integrate the musical intelligence into how we teach and what we teach? Interpersonal, we share, we do a think, pair, share, chat with a partner. We teach each other. You have students come up and they teach ideas that they've learned about. We collaborate on creating something. We interact. We engage in dialogue. Intrapersonal intelligence. We journal on our own. We have personal reflection time. We sit in silence. We don't need to talk. We can have conversations with ourselves. It doesn't always have to be this person talking to that person. Sometimes we need to have time to talk to ourselves, communicate with ourselves. And then naturalistic, which is we experience learning in the natural environment. It's actually amazing what type of impact it can have on learning if we take students outside of a windowless room and outside, particularly if it's not misty and rainy outside. How that stimulates these gears churning for a lot of students. So I like this graphic because anytime I set up a lesson plan or a curriculum, I'm always challenging myself to think creatively about, okay, I've done something that was very verbal and linguistic, so at the second part of the class, maybe I want to do something that's a little more bodily and kinesthetic. I'm a bodily kinesthetic learner. I learn a lot when someone asks me to move to one side of the room if I agree with something and to the other side of the room if I disagree with something. Or a four corners thing. If you strongly agree, strongly disagree, mildly disagree, and just move around and be able to see people. The other brilliant thing about that, just a quick example about using your body to express how you think about something is, some people don't want to talk. So I gave that example in Cambodia. Some people had some English, but it wasn't very good. They weren't very proud of it, and they didn't want to speak it in front of people who were fluent English speakers, native English speakers. But I could ask a question, it could be interpreted, and people could say, and people could express their opinion without actually having to vocalize it. And that is very empowering for people, because if you just ask people to share something vocally, that can actually shut out a lot of folks who aren't comfortable speaking in front of a large group. I mean, this is kind of some basic ideas, but I think putting it in this multiple intelligence idea is helpful. Nurturing emotional intelligence. This is based off a lot of work of Daniel Goleman, Martin Seligman, I mentioned him earlier. Acknowledging the emotions, feelings, and experiences that each learner brings to the environment, and then helping them find ways to cope with those emotions and manage the social interactions that are influenced by those emotions. And then nurturing compassion and empathy among students in ways that allow them to be sensitive and aware of other people's emotions. Bill, it sounds like you were talking about a little bit about this earlier. Students have a wealth of information and experience. And that can be used to huge benefit, particularly in a peace and conflict class, because we all have experiences with conflict. And we're all coming into that classroom with some type of conflict, whether it was, I don't want to get up in the morning, put my shoes on, and go to class. That's an internal conflict. And spending a little bit of time, I'm talking like 3 minutes. I always do a check-in with my students. Scale of 1 to 5, how are you feeling? 1, I'm not feeling good right now. Either because I'm frustrated, I'm angry at somebody, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, something has happened, I just want to be silent today. To 5, I'm excited, I'm energized, I'm ready to go, I want to contribute, I'm happy, I'm joyful. Just in that 3 minutes, that gives me a lot of information in terms of, okay, there's this dynamic going on in the room right now because I took 3 minutes to do that check-in. It also helps other students realize maybe I don't want to push that person's buttons today because they're not in a good space right now. And for those emotions to be acknowledged, I don't want to unpack them, or this is not a therapy session, but for those emotions simply to be acknowledged can have amazing effects in terms of how people experience that learning, that moment of learning. So these are some examples. There's obviously a lot of different emotions that people bring into the different classrooms, but you've probably seen these faces on a lot of your students. And with younger students, a lot of teachers will just say, just in order so they have the different vocabulary, it's like, well, which ones of these emotions have you been experiencing this week? So they recognize those emotions in themselves, they can communicate them, they can recognize those emotions in others. So this is an image that I kind of keep fresh in my mind every time I have students walk into my classroom. Exploring approaches to peace. And I think David's session that's coming up, Models of Peace Building, will touch on this, which is breaking down an ideal overarching concept of peace into manageable bites and methods of actualization. Peace, for a lot of folks who are just entering into this field, is a huge, idealistic, unrealistic, dare I say, concept, because it hasn't been broken down into the various strategies and approaches and understandings of it. So I really like Ian Harris's 7 Strategies for Peace. Ian Harris is a peace educator, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. You can download this when I send out the slides, but he has 7 strategies for peace. Peace through politics, peace through, I can't remember all of them, peace through politics, peace through transformation, peace through education, peace through strength. The idea is that a lot of people want peace, but their end goal of what peace looks like is going to be different. And the strategy and means through which they use to achieve those goals might be different. So it's important to understand that just because I don't view peace the same way that you do doesn't mean that we're not also peacemakers. So a lot of conversation can happen if we can break down this overarching idea of peace into manageable bites and methods of actualization. One thing that I do to kind of really reinforce this idea of manageable bites and methods of actualization is, in my peace education class, every single week, I send out a daily peace action. And this is something that they are asked to do or invited to do every single day that week. And it's something that as educators, you can do as an individual that might make you feel more at peace and increase your wellness. And it's something that you could adapt to use with your students in your classroom. So for example, I did 5 minutes of quiet time with my DC public school teachers. I said, this week our daily peace action is quiet time. I'm asking you to find 5 minutes every day this week to sit in silence and be present, or try and be present for 5 minutes, and then at the end we're going to talk about what that experience was like for you. And we're going to talk about how quiet time has been used in classrooms with young students and old students, and what type of impact that has had on their learning experience. We had something, one week we had gratitude letters. I asked them, every day this week I want you to sit down and write a letter to somebody in your life, from the distant past to the recent future, or to the recent present, someone who's had a positive impact on your life, and you want to tell them, wow, I appreciate and I value what you did for me in that moment. And I want you to sit down and write that person an email, a letter, actually write it out and send it to them. What was that experience like? How could you incorporate that concept into your class? And I had one teacher, she teaches at Wilson High School in Washington, D.C., and they were doing a session, a unit on the civil rights movement. One of the custodians who works at the school, her name is Mrs. Lee, is 82 years old and was involved in the civil rights movement and participated in a lot of the actions in the D.C. area. She came in and spoke with the students about her experience being involved in the civil rights movement in the D.C. area. And just the students were just absolutely amazed at her story. Little did they know that Mrs. Lee, the custodian, had all this experience, all this knowledge to share with them. After she came and spent the class with them, every single student wrote a gratitude letter to Mrs. Lee. She came into class the next day, went to the teacher, her name is Mary Ann Zare, is the teacher's name who set this up, and she just came and gave her a big hug and gave her a big kiss, that it meant so much to me that your students sat down and wrote those gratitude letters to me, appreciating what I was able to share with them. Imagine what that does to Mrs. Lee, what that does to Mary Ann, what that does for the students, and literally having that gratitude letter be part of the learning experience. That creates peace. I'm going to skip that. Reframing history. Challenging the dominance of violence and war in the narratives of cultures, countries, and peoples, and really changing the lens through which we look at major historical shifts, the way that we construct heroes, and develop cultural norms. You don't have to be a teacher to do this. We make references to history all the time in our teaching, whether it's in, again, math, science, history, physical ed, whatever. When we walk around the DC area, a lot of the monuments, they acknowledge and recognize violent conflict and the heroism in violent conflict. That is valuable. I'm not saying that it's not valuable, because violent conflict has created significant social change, but so has nonviolent conflict. And so how can we stress the importance of nonviolent conflict and the role that it has played in creating heroes and creating major historical shifts? A great book is by Elise Bolding, an amazing peace educator. Her husband, actually, Kenneth Bolding, if you look up peace economics, his name will probably show up on your Google search. The two of them are a peace ed powerhouse. Elise Bolding unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but she has a book called Cultures of Peace, The Hidden Side of History. If you want to delve into, to start developing that new lens of reframing history, highly recommend checking out her book. Transforming conflict nonviolence. We got two more here. Transforming conflict nonviolently. embracing the inevitability of conflict. Embracing the inevitability of conflict by practicing nonviolent ways to wage it, to manage it, and resolve it. That's one of the key things that you will hear as you delve further and further into peace and conflict studies. Conflict is not inherently a bad thing. But oftentimes, you work with your students, I can pretty much guarantee if you ask your students, write down 5 words that you associate with the word conflict, every single one of those words probably will be negative. They'll say argument, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, but they'll say fighting, war, anger, frustration. But it takes a one split second to have people understand conflict is absolutely necessary for change to occur. And some of the greatest peaceful actions in the world are peaceful, forceful actions have been conflict. That's what nonviolent movements are. They're actually creating conflict, but they're creating conflict and waging conflict using nonviolent means. The recommended resource I have here is a little book of restorative justice. And restorative justice is a great thing to kind of explore as well with your students if you're looking at peace and conflict studies. And that's restorative justice as opposed to retributive justice or punitive justice, where there's a victim and there's a perpetrator, and the victim is someone who is locked away in jail and is punished. That's the system that we have in the United States, a system that happens actually in many parts of the world. But there's an emerging form of justice called restorative justice, which is built off of healing the relationships that have been damaged as a result of the act. Whether it's bullying, whether it's murder, whether it's destruction of property, you name it, there is a system of justice that is used in other parts of the world, in schools, in the United States, that have had profound impacts on how to heal a relationship that has been damaged by a wrongful act. And then the image here is, of course, Gandhi during the Salt Satyagraha. And this is a great example of, that's conflict right there. He is waging conflict with the British Empire. And he's saying, right now, you tax us and you sell us salt that we can actually go to the sea and pick up with our own hands, boil in our homes, and make by ourselves. That is one of the most fundamental examples of injustice and oppression that every single Indian faces in this country, because we all cook with salt here. And so I'm going to march millions of people, hundreds of miles to the sea, and we're going to break the law. And I'm going to tell you that we're going to do that. This wasn't a surprise. This is what I'm going to do. We're going to break the law. Conflict, let's have at it. And we know how the outcome of that. And then lastly is skill building. Building, practicing, and adopting life skills that empower individuals to bring about peace in the world around them. Interpersonal skills, intrapersonal skills, analytical skills, conflict resolution skills, organizing skills, and learning skills. Here's the point to all this. What happens in this room is all fine and dandy, but I don't think it has much impact unless what happens in my classrooms has some type of impact outside of the classroom, outside of the school walls. Are students doing something different in their home, with their relationships, with their friends, with their family members? Are they doing something different in terms of how they analyze political situations, the government shutdown? Are they thinking differently when they read and hear something on the news in terms of what are the assumptions that that person is making in writing the story or delivering the story? The work that I do, and I think the work that we do as peace and conflict educators, we have to have the intentionality of what we do in this room has to have impact outside of this room. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's not. For me, peace and conflict studies is not an intellectual exercise. It's developing skills that you can use in the real world.